Good afternoon. So those of you who have studied history know the importance of understanding the past as a way to understand the present, to avoid mistakes already made, and as a source of inspiration for wiser future solutions. So I'm certain that anyone who has read my fellow Canadian John Vaillant's most recent Pulitzer Prize nominated work, Fireweather, would agree that his powerful recounting of the 2016 wildfire that destroyed so much of the city of Fort McMurray in the heart of Canada's oil country was all the more terrifying because nobody who experienced that fire had expected it. How could anyone have imagined leaving for work or school in the morning and learning in the middle of the afternoon that their home had suddenly disappeared in a wall of environmental energy? As John explained, humanity's relationship with fire, with our environment, has changed. So the question is why, and is this irrevocable? Thank you. Through his prolific, award-winning writing, most recently The Burning Earth, Yale University historian Sunil Amrith has given us several hundred years of the context that we need, especially here on the Indian subcontinent. Context that includes the extraordinary expansion of empires, of genocide, of human freedom, and with that, the expansion of the erosion of the very fabric of the planet we live on. And here to moderate the discussion between these two distinguished people and hopefully lead us towards possible solutions, we're fortunate to have Mridula Ramesh. And I say fortunate because through her writing, including the excellent books, The Climate Solution and Watershed, through her work as the founder of the Sundaram Climate Institute, through her role as an angel investor in clean tech startups and in other writings and lectures, Mridula has very much focused on solutions. So please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel.
Thank you for being here. I can't believe it's early February in Jaipur. Many of us are inappropriately dressed with scarves and silks when we should actually be just wearing shorts and a t-shirt. That's the kind of weather that we have. The problem with climate is that it creeps up so slowly, like a smoldering fire or a furtive cancer, that what would have been easy to solve or quell in its early stages just gets out of control so quickly. If we needed a reminder that now is, the best time to talk about fire would have been 20 years ago, but the second best time, to paraphrase a Chinese saying, is today. We got it just, recently in LA, where even the rich and the powerful and the famous their houses were reduced to cinders. And it was a battlefield against a new kind of enemy. And I don't think we were winning. So with that, I think, we've got two great authors. In our conversation yesterday, the challenge was just to hold back and structure because we can just so easily talk for hours. But the sense that you're going to get, and I would really recommend you to read their phenomenal books. It gives you a very different perspective. They both come at it through very different angles, but they come at the same heart. There is a saying called truth is a pathless land, but they come at it through different paths, right? And at the heart of that path is philosophy. And that's the kernel around which everything is wrapped around. So we're going to have a great discussion today looking at the different paths at which you can get to that philosophy and hopefully see where it is. And in philosophy lies the solution as well. So with that, John, I'm going to ask you, why fire?
Good morning, everybody. It's so good to be back with you again. I did a session a couple of days ago, and it's just been a dream of mine to be at this festival. So to get to see you again is really a wonderful pleasure. So thank you for that. In 2016, the petroleum hub of Fort McMurray, Alberta, which is the largest source of foreign imports of oil into the United States, was overrun by wildfire, driving the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times anywhere in the world. And no one was expecting it, and of course I wasn't. I was working on a novel at the time, but the way that fire behaved, its intensity, its violence, the persistence with which it attacked that city day and night for a week, led me to, and many other climate scientists, to understand we're entering a new fire regime, not just in Canada, not just in North America, but globally. And Fort McMurray was just an early example. And so I worked for 7 years on this book, and part of what took so long was realizing how that this fire is not an external thing to us. It's actually a companion of ours. We grew up with it. It helped shape us. It's our superpower. And when I began to look at the similarities between human behavior and fire behavior, things got a lot more complicated. And so I wanted to start with a short passage from the book. I spent a chapter exploring the kinship between human beings and fire. I think I can do it. I just need that. No, I think I'm good. It's fire's nature to strive upward. In other words, to aspire, which means literally to breathe desire into, and also to rise. Fire, it can be said, is aspiration in its purest form, desire burning, and burning desire, to exist, to consume, to grow, to flourish, all as fervently as we do. Fire does not have consciousness, but it does have character, and there are internal and external factors that motivate, guide, deter, and defeat it. One of those factors is us. There's no other natural force or element over which we have such a compelling illusion of control. Fire is the only disaster that can be initiated by a gesture as casual as dropping a match. And this complicates our relationship to it in some profound ways. Since the dawn of the Petrocene age in 1860, we have given fire exponentially more opportunities to engage in all those behaviors we seem to emulate and excel at. But like Ariel to our Prospero, fire is a begrudging servant, selfish and willful. It yearns above all for freedom, which it will take at any opportunity and at any cost. And it has enabled the same impulses in us. So we're potent collaborators. Thanks. We're potent collaborators and almost kind of like drinking buddies, urging each other on to greater and greater heights of achievement and or outrage. And in order to explore this kinship that I've discovered we have with fire, I wanted to do a breathing exercise with all of you. It's a breathing exercise and also a trust exercise. And it's about oxygen. And fire is driven by oxygen. We are driven by oxygen. We are both burners and breathers, generating heat. You're all 37 degrees Celsius right now. It's much cooler than that. Your little furnaces all burning out there. We're furnaces burning up here. We're fueled by oxygen, generating heat, off-gassing CO2, just as fire does. So I want to explore our relationship with fire a little more deeply over the next 30 seconds. I want to invite you all to take a big breath, and when I count 3, to exhale and not inhale again.
And I've got a timer here, so I'll actually
I've got
be
a
watching.
timer, and I will be kind. So what we'll do is, on the count of 3, we'll exhale, and for 30 seconds, we'll just leave our lungs empty and notice how we feel. So I'm going to start in 1, 2, 3, big exhale. Just notice where your thoughts go. Notice what's happening in your lungs. Notice what your hands and feet are doing. Notice if you feel calm or agitated. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Big breath in. Take a big breath in. Fill your lungs. Fuel that fire. And if you're like me, what I noticed when I do that exercise is my bandwidth of attention and interest really narrows. And if we had played this out for another 30 seconds, another 90 seconds, what you would find is all your please and thank yous go away, your concern for your neighbor goes away, your thinking about your sore toe goes away, your wishing you had a coffee right now goes away, and everything gets really, really focused on that breath, on that burning in your lungs. And I think that's a way to understand the single-minded motivation of fire. And if things got desperate enough, you would begin to disregard your neighbor in your effort to get oxygen if you knew where oxygen could be had. And that's how fire behaves, very single-mindedly. So I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you, John. I think you've got us all focused. But Sunil, let me come to you. I think when we confront a threat or we confront a change, we're often guided by, if we're children, we're guided by the way we are brought up. If we're a civilization, we are guided by our history. People always say, let's look to history for lessons. But is it really lessons, or are we shackled by the legacies of history?
I think that's just the right way to put the question, Mridula. I think what John's work shows us, and what so many climate scientists have shown us, is that we are literally living through an unprecedented set of conditions. In that sense, it's out of the range of most past human experience. And so if we're looking for history for simple lessons, I think we are not going to get very far. But I think what we need to grapple with in a profound way is the legacies of history, because we can start with the most foundational of questions. How have we divided this world? Who has divided this world? Where have we drawn the borders that divide countries, that divide people? Those distinctions are becoming more and not less important, however unprecedented the climatic conditions that we are living through. So in that sense, we could say we are shackled by history. We could say that we are just inescapably shaped by history. Our most fundamental ideas, the ideas which we bring to perceive an accelerating climate crisis, have very deep roots. I mean, think of an idea like development. It's embedded in all of us, what that means. So many of the aspirations that we hold are embedded in very specific and particular histories. And I think that that rupture from the past, which the climate crisis represents, is also a form of loss. We talk about loss and damage, and there are losses that we can't count. And one of those losses is that sense of being cut off from our past. And this is not trivial. If I may, I'd just like to quote very briefly from Kautea Natano, who was the Prime Minister of Tuvalu for 5 years up till last year. And what he said is this. He said, most societies see climate changes mainly about cutting carbon emissions or mitigating future impacts. We are facing a looming situation far more profound. The near certainty of terminal inundation. Our peoples in my generation and the next will be unable to exist on the islands that have nurtured our ancestors for centuries. So I think we need to think about history in two contradictory ways, in a sense, both of which are true. On the one hand, history is what keeps us stuck. It's what stops us from being able to imagine other possibilities. And history is our tether to what it is to be human, and that is actually imperiled by the conditions around us. And so I don't think it's lessons from history that we're looking for. I think we have to think very deeply about how history has shaped us and how history has shaped the world we live in.
A tether and a shackle, depending on the perspective that you need. And in some ways, that's actually very empowering, because you can choose whether it is your tether or it is your shackle. But again and again we go to philosophy, and that is a philosophy in itself. But I think if you've been attending the climate sessions over the days, you get a sense that this is really something different, right? If you've lived through a climate event in the last few months, I don't even have to say last 5 years or last year or something, it's the last month, okay? And you get a sense that it's different. And John, what I really enjoyed in your reading is it's evocative, right? It's sort of, the language in your book shakes you a little bit. And you use the term tsunami of fire. Are we confronting a different beast?
Yeah, I think it's inescapably true. I coined a term in fire weather, which is 21st century fire, and it has certain attributes. It burns more intensely, more broadly, for longer, and it is generating phenomena that human beings have never seen come out of a wildfire. So in 2016, when the fire swept through Fort McMurray, which, by the way, is in the subarctic of Canada, the lakes were frozen when this fire was burning. The temperature record for that day in history was broken by 6 degrees Celsius. The flames were 100 meters tall across a fire front 10 kilometers wide, projecting radiant heat, which is the invisible heat that tells you not to touch the candle. The radiant heat coming out of this wall of fire was 500 Celsius, which is hotter than the planet Venus. This swept into the city of Fort McMurray, desiccating everything in front of it and causing every hydrocarbon, whether it was a spruce tree or a rubber tire or a plastic swing set or a Formica counter or a foam mattress, to off-gas hydrocarbons and burst into flame when the embers landed. So $750,000 houses built by wealthy oil workers burnt to the basement in 5 minutes. No firefighter had ever seen anything like that. 2 years later, in Redding, California, 1,000 miles to the south, there was another fire. It was well over, I think, 45 Celsius or so, 42 Celsius. And that wildfire generated an EF3 tornado, a tornado made out of fire that tore houses off their foundations, that tore 100-foot high-tension power lines with many tons of heavy cable strung across them out of the ground, hurled them into the forest. One volunteer firefighter gave up his vacation, got in his big, heavy 5-ton F-150 Ford pickup truck to drive back to help. The tornado picked up his truck, threw it through the air, rolled it, and incinerated it. And that's the energy that we're dealing with. And that is not just North America. This is now a global possibility.
No, I'm just going to probe a little more. In your book, you talk of being able to see it from space, like the Americans reaching out to the Canadians and saying, "Are you guys doing nuclear testing?"
Yeah. So there's a phenomenon now that used to only occur over volcanoes called a Pyro-cumulonimbus fire cloud. And so these are these epic pictures of Krakatoa, the billowing clouds shot through with lightning, scenes from biblical, apocalypse. Well, satellites started to pick these up in the late 90s in places where there were no volcanoes. And one of the first came out of Alberta, Canada, not far from Fort McMurray. And the US Navy, with their satellite tracking, inquired of the nation of Canada, have you just detonated a nuclear device? It wasn't a nuclear device. It was the Chisholm fire, which generated the equivalent of, I think, 7 megatons of nuclear energy over a period of 7 hours. Again, at the time, the fastest moving, most intense fire ever measured on Earth. So these pyro-CBs, these pyro-cumulonimbus clouds, reach a height of 45,000 feet. They puncture the stratosphere. They create their own weather system, essentially a perpetual motion machine of flame moving across the landscape. And in 2023, the Black Summer of Canada by itself generated 142 pyro-cumulonimbus fire systems in one fire season, unheard of in the history of Homo sapiens.
What I was struck by a lot of the language you were using is a sense of brutalization, right? And violence. And in your book, you use an allegory of what fire is, right? And I want to turn to you, Sunil, to explore that allegory, the other part of the fire allegory, and the sense of violence. Who is perpetuating? What is the kindling? Who lit the match? Who's fanning the flames? And in that sense, who's creating the violence and for what reason?
So one of the things that strikes me, John, is hearing you speak just now, is as far as I know, the first ever use of the word firestorm was during the Second World War. And that was when the Allied bombings of Dresden and Tokyo created such incendiary force that you can read the descriptions at the time and it is cyclonic.
Yeah.
And I think the way I have charted the story in The Burning Earth, one of the things that struck me most is that our path to the climate crisis is driven by warfare and violence, and that there are these moments of intensification and acceleration that we need to reckon with. And there's a very interesting reversal in metaphor. We're thinking about metaphors. So the beginning of the First World War, David Lloyd George, who went on to become the British Prime Minister, described the war as being like a natural disaster. He said it's like a cyclone, it's like an earthquake. It's as if only the language of the violence of nature could capture that. By the end of the war, that metaphor had been turned on its head. The Norwegian meteorologists who came up with the theory that we still use to understand climate, the theory of weather fronts, used the image of fronts in the First World War to describe some of the most awesome forces of nature. That they were trying to describe how mid-latitude cyclones form. And they're like, these are like fronts on the battlefield. This is in 1918, 1919. And it is as if the destructive power of the war was so much that now, just a few years later, it's as if human armies represent the greatest possible destructive power. Who lit the fires? Well, in this part of the world, I think we have to reckon with a long history of imperial violence as creating so many of the conditions for unrestrained accumulation and inequality that we're still grappling with. But I don't think it's just a material history. I think one of the most insightful things that Rabindranath Tagore wrote during the First World War was he suggested that violence also had a moral effect, that it dimmed our empathy, it dimmed our ability to identify not only with other humans, but with other forms of life. And I mean, in some sense, Tagore's take on the First World War was that the only conditions under which such a conflict was possible was one in which the living planet had come to be completely disregarded and seen as a machine for the creation of wealth. And I think we're still living with that.
Oh, super.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah,
And
of
because
course.
I'm just resonant, I'm just over here nodding my head. Yeah, no, it really, you spoke so much truth there and so much what I discovered from different angles, but I made the mistake of counting the number of fires that humans make every day, and including each individual combustion in every internal combustion engine, and we make trillions of fires every day. So human beings around the globe generate galaxies worth of fires, of combustions. And the accumulated violence of that, were you to gather it all in one place, would have an energy comparable to a supervolcano.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really apt that strange inversion. Who is the force of nature now?
Right.
Who is the force of unnature? Yes. And so this explosive energy, at the root of it, is violence. And I'm thinking of, you're talking about, imperial power, and I'm thinking about imperial oil. Imperial Oil is the Canadian subsidiary of Exxon. And the fire generated by the petroleum industry is colossally violent. And if we were all indoors, if we were in Canada now, we'd be having this session indoors, and if we were to take a single car engine that brought us here and took it out of the hood of the vehicle and took the mufflers off, took the insulation off, mounted it here, put it on that chair, and fired it up, it would deafen everybody in the room, and then it would gas us to death. A single engine. And so what engineers have done, beautifully is insulated us from this colossal violence, much as the developed world, the wealthy world, has been insulated from the violence of their cost of living, if you will. And there's a real metaphor there in the engineering of the modern car, where we can sit graciously and have a conversation and maybe listen to a bit of music as we drive around the city. Meanwhile, under the hood, this incredible kind of enslaved energy is bashing away at a deafening decibels, off-gassing out the back in ways that we don't notice. You know, we notice it more here in Jaipur, but in many other places we don't. And so that Jeff Goodell, who was here last year, he wrote The Heat Will Kill You First. He talked about air conditioning similarly as a technology of forgetting. And I think the ultimate technology of forgetting is the power of the petroleum industry and the way it infiltrates and informs everything we do and are, and yet we don't see it.
You've set up the segue beautifully to the next point. Why, you know, at some level you get the analogy of lambs being led to slaughter. And, you know, whether we like it or not, we're all complicit. And I think you mentioned several times that there are benefits to this fossil fuel and we're going along with it. And central to going along with it is what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. And history really is, written history is what we choose to emphasize and what we choose to forget. So can you speak to that, please?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, as John beautifully pointed out just now, there's a forgetting in everyday life. We all forget, you know, the energy and also the human labor that makes possible so much of what we do. We make invisible whole groups of people. We make invisible the non-human. Certainly until, you know, the last decade or two, most history has been written with only human protagonists. And as Amitav Ghosh has pointed out in his writing, most literary fiction has been written with only human protagonists. More about our internal moral dilemmas and dramas than the world around us. Richard Powers has this wonderful way of putting it. He says, we write as if the battle against nature had been won. And so I think there's a forgetting there. And I mean, that forgetting is at the very heart of the book that I wrote, The Burning Earth. I mean, the first lines of that book are, once upon a time, all history was environmental history, which is to say that most societies, for most of human history, could not function as if human beings were apart from the rest of nature. There was an utter dependence in everyday life, as there still is for people all over the world. But the comfortable and the wealthy amongst us have been able to insulate ourselves. And I think with that comes forgetting. There are other layers of forgetting when we talk about, you know, written history, what's remembered, what's left out. Mridula, you and I were talking just yesterday about the history of famines in this country. And the fact that the very conditions that paved the way for the global north to prosper economically, the benefits of which are still being enjoyed in the global north today, were literally built upon the bodies of tens of millions of people who died of famine in this country, in Brazil, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And so I think we talk a lot about environmental justice. That conversation, I think, can't be had without some form of reckoning with what has been made invisible, indeed what has often actively been erased from our histories, but also from the way that we live every day.
Super. Thank you so much. No, but moving to this sense of forgetting, what we've chosen to remember, what we've chosen to emphasize, has created this myth of human exceptionalism, which fire seems to be melting away. And John, I mean, repeatedly you use this term magical as almost an absurdity of human exceptionalism. And that's a theme running through your books.
Well, the irony is that fire has enabled our exceptionalism. And so that, you know, we really are in partnership with fire. And right now, I think up until now, we've been under the illusion that fire has been serving us. We have mastered this energy. We've moved from wood to coal to fossil fuels and into more rarefied gases. And all the while becoming wealthier, becoming more mobile, being able to have glorious events like this. And at the same time, what we're starting to see, and what climate scientists saw literally 70 years ago, scientists who worked for petroleum companies and told them 70 years ago, is that the CO2 generated by the petroleum industry, which at root is a fire industry, had the capacity to alter the climate in ways we are discovering that favor fire. So this raises the question right now in terms of exceptionalism, who's serving whom? Is fire our servant, or are we in fact fire's servants? And I think of Michael Pollan's amazing book, The Botany of Desire, where these humble plants, little apples, little daffodils, tulips, and marijuana, they're very local little plants, had these qualities that were appealing to people, leading them to disseminate them across the globe and turn them into global species. Well, I would say fire is the ultimate expression of that domestication of desire. And we have now empowered fire to burn more intensely, more broadly across planet Earth than at any other time in human history. And that is an alarming accomplishment.
Yeah, enough. I think we're taking on nature. And, if you take the long view of history, 500 million years, the climate's changing. And I have absolutely no doubt that the vast, species in nature will survive. I'm less optimistic about our way of life. But very quickly, before we turn it over to audience, end on hope, guys. End on hope.
Oh, I know. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
It needs to be contagious.
Hope on demand. No, you go first.
Yeah, hope on demand.
No, I'm really excited to be alive right now. And we're alive at an historic moment, an historic reckoning, a time that invites us rather harshly and firmly to be brutally honest with ourselves. It's an invitation to reconnect with nature. Nature is communicating with us now eloquently and increasingly violently and saying, we are out of balance and you are putting stresses on me, you, humanity, are putting stresses on me that are unbearable, and I can no longer maintain the stability that I was able to maintain that enabled you to prosper and flourish as you have. And so this is a reckoning with our own appetites. It's a reckoning with each other. It's a reckoning with the petroleum industry, which absolutely has to happen and is working aggressively to stay in the shadows, stay out of the limelight, when in fact, again, I have to emphasize, the petroleum industry is a fire industry, and it is burning us down. It has no incentive to stop. And we can see now by looking at LA, by looking at the increasing droughts, that the heating of the world is stressing us beyond habitability, and we know how to stop that. And so this is a reckoning in terms of our moral courage. We're seeing this in political movements around the world. We are being forced to take stands that our predecessor had to take in our stead. And now it's our turn. And that is galvanizing, it's frightening, but also what an incredible time to exert the full power of our intelligence and love and humanity and community.
Thank you, John.
That was beautifully put, John. If I think about why we're interested in history, it is often because history gives us analogies. And I'm interested in history not because it can tell us how we're going to navigate the climate crisis, because it can't. I'm interested in histories that show us how change is possible in a very short period of time. Histories where entire groups of people question everything. They question the institutions and powers that govern them. They question the values that they live by. I mean, why are we so drawn to studying the Indian freedom movement? I don't think it's because we feel like there are lessons we can draw from this or that leader. I think it is because there is something exhilarating about imagining a moment where a seemingly invincible empire is actually brought down by people's actions, by people's activities. And I see the environmental movement the same way. If I have a cause for hope, it is that the paradigm shift brought over just a few decades around the world by environmental activists is revolutionary. And they face enormous obstacles, and yet there is something, I think, quite freeing and transformative about that change in consciousness that we are living through. So that gives me hope.
No, thank you for that. And to the audience, we're going to turn it over. Thank you both. I mean, get their books. It's really a worthwhile investment. And if I was to just give you a bit of hope, there's beautiful green. There's a lovely forest, short way from here. Just go into the forest and you'll feel your soul cleansed, almost as though you've had a peel or a facial or something for your soul. So with that, we'll turn over to the audience. Any questions? If you don't, I have. So there is a gentleman in the long sleeve blue shirt in the back. And then there is a woman, there's a person waving their hand. If you could just stand up, we'll get the mics to you. And then there is a gentleman in the front. So, yeah. But only questions, please.
Doesn't Donald Trump know all this? And America's voted him. Doesn't America know all this?
America does know. I think some very interesting choices are being made that have something to do with election cycles, but I think also have to do with a kind of doubling down on exceptionalism. And I also think that the very wealthy and who's spoken beautifully about this is Amitav Ghosh. He really nailed it, I think. But I think somehow once you have 9 zeros after your name, the billionaire class imagines themselves being exempt from many of the laws that control the rest of us, or that the rest of us choose to obey, and including environmental laws, including laws of physics and chemistry. And so they believe that they can survive the coming crisis, and we are expendable. And Amitav Ghosh speaks more eloquently on this than I can. But there's an intellectual choice, and I think along with that, there's a kind of, I'm taking a flyer here, but I think there is an economic, financial, market-driven analog to the rapture that motivates and animates a lot of the decision-making. And it's completely magical thinking. It's totally disconnected from actual chemistry and physics that control life on Earth. But if you insulate yourself in that bubble of keeping a track on the numbers, keeping a track on your ratings, that you can somehow skate over the top of this impending reality. And there's lots more to say on that. It's a really, really important question. Thank you.
Thank you, John. The lady shaking a hand over there, and then there's gentleman in the front over here. Do we have another mic? Can we just, to save time, I'm going to take 2 questions at a time, if you don't mind. This gentleman in the black and white.
Okay, so my question is that climate migration has said to be part of the solution, but according to my understanding, it's only a temporary solution. So what are your thoughts on the matter?
Could you just repeat the second part of your question?
Sorry. I was saying climate migration has said to be part of the solution, but according to my understanding, it's only a temporary solution, even if we create northern enclaves. So I was asking, what are your thoughts on the matter?
Thank you so much. That's a really powerful and important question. When climate migration is discussed in the global north, it is discussed on the basis of a very inaccurate understanding of the picture. So when we see climate migration covered in the global north, the idea is that people from around the world are going to be waiting at the gates of the world's wealthiest countries, waiting to be let in. We know that that's completely untrue. That 90% of people who are likely to be displaced by the effects of climate change in the next 30 years are going to move within their own countries. That those who cross an international border will cross the closest international border to where we live. And those borders are ever more dangerous, militarized, risky places. And so I think throughout history, migration has been a very natural way in which human societies have dealt with challenges of extreme weather. But I think we need to remember that it is just as likely that people will be stuck and unable to move in the years ahead as there will be large-scale climate migration. Not everyone can move everywhere, and I think we also need to remember that there are large numbers of people in this world who do not want to move. And climate migration as a planned policy solution has been contested by many of the small Pacific Island states, for example, who see that as a rupture with everything that matters to communities. So I think there is no alternative to a more generous and humane way of governing international migration. I think countries with the resources ought to be far more hospitable and open than they are to people who are being displaced by climate change. But my concern is that we assume that migration is an option for people when in fact it is often not.
Thank you. That gentleman over there.
As Mridula ma'am initially pointed out, the philosophical foundations of both these books. So I just want to ask about the role of India that India can play when we juxtapose the Indian philosophical foundation, especially Advaita and Vedantic foundation. We find that there is no anthropocentrism, that it's always nature is one and we are just part of it. And even
And the
Agni,
question, please.
question is role of India, that when we see the Western values, especially Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic values, it's about human exceptionalism, that it's about all the nature is created for human beings only.
So the role of
can,
humans.
especially when Trump is there, where can India show the ways in some way?
Thank you.
I think we need to draw on the full diversity of traditions that we have in every culture. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is, in fact, if you look even at European history, there are all sorts of ways of living and being that have been marginalized. I don't think there is even a sort of singular Western worldview. I think each of these is a subject of struggle. Each of these is a subject of contested ideas. I think within Indian culture, within Southeast Asian cultures, within Chinese culture, there are so many possible ways out. There are so many ways of reimagining our place in nature. And I think there are those traditions in indigenous societies in North America as well. And indeed, in sort of minority and marginalized traditions at the very heart of the global north. And so I think that we should imagine a collage of these traditions from everywhere, because we need all of that wisdom that we can get.
That being said, Sunil, I will say that a lot of different engineering philosophies, which is something I look at, a dam is very different from a tank system with very different philosophies embedded. And these are found not just in India, but in much of the world. One more. We have a lot more. So I'm going to ask that lady over there and then that lady over there. Can we just get 2 mics, and can you keep the question short, please, so we can get more people?
So, with every petroleum company giving an integrated energy plan for the next 50 years and targets for all the scope emissions, what do you think about them helping with this climate crisis?
Okay, one more question, and then we'll...
I actually live in Silicon Valley, and I understand that the petrochemical industry has been responsible. But going forward, what about all the million searches we do on Google and the heat generated by them? That's my question.
Yeah. Right now, the renewable energy that we're generating, which is a sign for enormous hope, you know, there's a pathway out, but right now there's phenomenon of the Jevons paradox, where it's not a replacement energy, it's just being added to and enhancing our ability to consume. So it's not replacing coal, it's not replacing gas, it's just because of search engines, because of AI, because of the extraordinary appetites of these server farms, along with burgeoning new economies, our appetite for energy is only growing. And so we are in, we don't know how that's going to resolve, but what we're seeing is elevating CO2, elevating methane, and elevating heat. And there's going to be, I don't think, a single breaking point. What we're seeing are these fractures. And the fractures are a meter of rain being dropped on North Carolina after Hurricane Helene. Another fracture is these floods in Pakistan a couple of years ago. Another fracture is the fires. And so what we're seeing is this fracturing of habitable systems and spaces. And we have not yet found a way to discipline that or check our appetite. And that's a really harsh reality that we're going to be reckoning with for the rest of the century.
And let's not, again, going back to what Sunil said about forgetting, let's not fool ourselves. We might take a bite out of nature, but when nature chooses to bite back, that's going to be brutal. Thanks. Thanks, guys. Please get their books. They will be available for signing. Thank you for being a good audience. I'm sorry we couldn't take any more questions, but thank you.